Usually when we talk about the direction of society, there's this underlying expectation of progress.
Right.
It's sort of like climbing a ladder. You invent a new technology, you reform some outdated laws, and the baseline assumption is that everyone is just, taking a step up.
Yeah, exactly.
It's this really comforting, optimistic, upward trajectory. We've all been fed this narrative that tomorrow is just inherently better than today.
Absolutely.
But then, you look at the raw data surrounding men in the modern era, right? We're talking plummeting workforce participation, cratering family formation rates, and just, frankly, absolutely terrifying mental health metrics.
Yeah, the numbers are grim.
They really are. And suddenly that ladder looks a lot more like a chute. Like we are looking at a landscape that feels increasingly and almost systematically hostile to the very men who built it.
Well, yeah, it's a perspective that really requires us to challenge some of the most foundational assumptions of modern Western culture.
Exactly. So if you are a man listening to this, trying to figure out your place in this rapidly shifting societal landscape, and if you've ever had this creeping, unavoidable suspicion that modern institutions are basically rigged against you, then, well, pull up a chair. Because this deep dive is custom tailored specifically for you.
We are essentially going to systematically deconstruct what we've been told is progress and, look at the actual structural mechanics underneath.
Right. And before we get into the thick of it, just a quick favor, hit that like button and subscribe to the show so you never miss out on these deep dives.
Yeah, please do.
Today, our mission is this really extensive, unvarnished review of a highly provocative new ebook. It's titled God, King, and Code: The Final Stand for Western Civilization Against the Feminist Singularity. It was written by Conrad Riker, published in 2026.
It's a heavy read.
Yeah. Very heavy. But this book is a blueprint, plain and simple, for surviving modern institutional collapse. I strongly encourage you to check out Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books right now to buy the book. And make sure you follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack to keep up with his ongoing work.
Highly recommend checking out the source material for yourself.
Definitely. So our goal today is to systematically unpack Riker's core thesis, which is how superhuman artificial intelligence and this feminist singularity have basically created a pincer movement to render traditional masculinity obsolete.
Right.
We're going to explore the historical capture of our institutions, the bizarre new economics of reproduction, and Riker's proposed exit strategy. But first, we really need to pause and make something crystal clear.
Yes, we do. This is an essential disclaimer for the listener. The material we are covering today is, well, it's highly politically charged.
Extremely.
It touches on both left-wing and right-wing ideologies,
Yeah.
deeply sensitive gender dynamics, and, major institutional power structures.
So we are explicitly stating to you, the listener, right now we are not taking sides, we are not endorsing the viewpoints of the author, Conrad Riker, nor are we advocating for any specific political faction.
Not at all.
Our sole purpose today is to impartially report on and analyze the ideas contained in the original source material. We are just here to help you understand the arguments being made, nothing more.
Exactly. Our entire focus is on clarity, synthesis, and just giving an objective analysis of the text provided.
Okay, let's unpack this. Riker starts by describing a trap, right? Like a dual threat that average men are facing today. He calls it the technological guillotine and the logic of male obsolescence. So what exactly is this pincer movement he's talking about?
Well, so Riker lays out this foundational argument that is, frankly, entirely devoid of sentimentality. I mean, he asserts that historically, across almost every human civilization, men derive their economic, social, and even moral value from two primary domains.
Which are?
Physical labor and cognitive labor. Like, if you go back even just a century, the muscle power to build infrastructure, to mine resources, defend borders, that was inherently male.
Right, it was just pure biology.
Exactly. And then as we moved into the information age, cognitive labor, so analysis, engineering, computation, that became the new frontier. But Riker argues we are now in an era where AI and advanced automation are systematically destroying the economic value of both of those domains.
Wow.
Yeah. The algorithm is outperforming the analyst, and robotics are beginning to outpace physical labor.
So basically the economic utility of the average guy is just dropping to zero.
Precisely. But the tragedy, according to Riker's framework, isn't just the technological displacement. I mean, technologies have displaced workers before, right? The loom, the tractor, the assembly line.
Sure, we've had industrial revolutions.
Right. The difference this time is the cultural reaction. Riker argues that a dominant cultural ideology, which he terms the feminist singularity, is simultaneously celebrating this displacement as some kind of moral victory over the patriarchy.
Man, that's a really dark way to frame it. It's not just that the factory closed down, it's that society is throwing a parade in the street because the factory closed down.
Yeah, and that celebration has profound psychological consequences.
Hmm.
To explain why this is so devastating, Riker leans heavily into evolutionary psychology.
Okay, how so?
Well, he references the psychological architecture of male identity. He brings up evolutionary psychologists, people like David Buss, who have spent decades documenting that a man's self-worth isn't just some flimsy social construct that you can, re-educate out of him.
Right, it's not just a societal norm.
Exactly. It is deeply, inextricably linked to a biological imperative to provide, to protect, and to problem solve. For hundreds of thousands of years, if a male couldn't provide or protect, he didn't reproduce. He died, and his genes died with him.
So it's hardwired. We're talking about biological firmware here.
Absolutely. When a labor market no longer requires a man's physical strength, and an algorithmic large language model just surpasses his cognitive output, that foundational architecture doesn't just adapt peacefully.
It breaks.
It collapses. And Riker brings the receipts on what happens when that collapse occurs on a societal level. He points to this landmark 2015 study by Princeton economists Ann Case and Angus Deaton.
Oh, right. Well, they coined the term deaths of despair, didn't they?
Yes, exactly.
Right, deaths of despair.
Yeah.
You're talking about suicide, severe opioid addiction, liver disease from chronic alcoholism, basically people essentially drinking or drugging themselves to death because the pain of obsolescence is just too much to handle.
And the statistics Riker cites from this dynamic are genuinely chilling. I mean, he specifically notes a 0.61 correlation coefficient between county-level male unemployment and county-level male suicide.
Wow.
Yeah, in statistical terms, a 0.61 is a massive, undeniable positive correlation.
So it's not a coincidence at all.
No, not at all. When men lose their work, they don't just lose a paycheck. They lose their teleology. They lose their reason to exist. And Riker makes a very pointed argument here. He says that if this exact correlation, this specific wave of mortality, were happening to literally any other demographic group, it would be declared a national health emergency.
Billions would be mobilized overnight.
Exactly. But because it's happening to men, particularly working class men, the institutional response is just apathy. Or even worse, it's condescension. They're told to go try therapy or just learn to code.
Which feels entirely disconnected from the root of the problem. Like, it assumes the man is fundamentally broken rather than acknowledging that the environment itself has become toxic.
Right.
And I think that leads to this other phenomenon he talks about, which started in Japan but is clearly going global now, right? Hikikomori.
Yes, extreme social withdrawal.
Yeah, where you have millions of young men locking themselves in their rooms, playing video games, watching porn, and just completely refusing to participate in society for years at a time. I've always seen Western media frame this as a failure to launch, like just pure laziness or entitlement. But Riker frames it completely differently, doesn't he?
He does, yeah. He frames hikikomori not as a pathology, but as a highly rational response to a labor and social market that essentially offers humiliation instead of dignity.
A rational response. That's fascinating.
In Riker's view, these men are applying the sort of subconscious cost-benefit analysis. They look at the society outside their bedroom door and realize the game is mathematically rigged against them.
Yeah.
I mean, why participate in a society that demands you sweat to extract your labor? Taxes that labor heavily but actively denies you respect, status, or any biological reward.
I have to say, that framing makes a lot of sense if you look at it mechanically. It's like playing a massive multiplayer online game where the developers not only patch out your character's unique abilities, rendering you totally useless in a raid, but they also continuously mock you in the patch notes for losing.
That's a great analogy.
Right, like why would you keep logging in? You're not broken for quitting, you just unplug the console.
That is a perfect encapsulation of Riker's point about the secondary wound of cultural ideology. The displacement caused by technology is painful enough on its own.
Sure.
But the feminist narrative, framing male job loss and downward mobility as this sort of cosmic justice, like the patriarch is finally getting what he deserves, it completely compounds the trauma. It denies men even the dignity of victimhood. They are told they are oppressors, even as they are being pushed to the very margins of society.
So this raises a huge logical question for me. Let's follow Riker's premise here. If men are being displaced economically and they are withdrawing from society in droves, who or what is replacing their historical role? Because women and children still need provision. They still need protection. If the biological father is being removed from the equation, what fills the vacuum?
Well, That logical question leads directly to one of the most provocative parts of the book, which is Riker's communalized husband theory.
The communalized husband theory. Okay.
He argues that the state itself has essentially stepped in to replace the patriarch.
Okay, this is a wild concept. Walk us through how a government bureaucracy becomes a husband.
So Riker uses Aristotelian logic to track the historical evolution of the state. If we look at the original purpose of the state, at least as articulated by Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke or Thomas Jefferson, the social contract was explicitly about the protection of negative rights.
Right, the basics.
The state existed to protect your life, your liberty, and your property from theft or violence. You pay taxes to fund a military, a police force, and a court system to enforce contracts.
Right, night watchmen, state stuff. The government paves the roads and keeps the borders secure, but it basically stays out of your house.
Exactly. But Riker argues this locking purpose has been entirely inverted today. The modern state no longer functions as a neutral arbiter. It is mutated into a massive resource extraction engine.
How so?
It systematically takes the property of productive men through progressive taxation and redistributes it through an expansive welfare state to women who will never be their wives and to children who are not biologically theirs.
Wow. So he's saying the state taxes the biological male, essentially turning him into a resource node to be farmed.
Yes.
And in return, the state assumes the role of the provider. It steps in with welfare, SNAP benefits, housing assistance, subsidized childcare, and also acts as the protector, using the police state. Things like the Violence Against Women Act or Title IX tribunals on college campuses.
We got it exactly. Riker asserts that the state has donned the mantle of the husband while simultaneously stripping actual biological husbands of their authority, their assets, and their leverage.
That is intense.
And to understand how this happened legally, Roker points to a specific historical marker. The 1969 California Family Law Act, which was signed by then-Governor Ronald Reagan. This inaugurated the era of no-fault divorce in America.
Wait, let's slow down here for a second. Why is no-fault divorce so pivotal to this specific theory? I mean, wasn't that just about letting people out of abusive marriages?
Well, under the old system of at-fault divorce, marriage was legally recognized as a binding contract. And a contract, by definition, implies mutual obligation.
Right.
If you wanted to break that contract, you had to prove a breach. Adultery, abuse, abandonment, things like that. There were actual penalties for the party who broke the contract. No-fault divorce unilaterally dissolved the permanence of that contract. It allowed marriage to be terminated at the absolute whim of either party for any reason or literally no reason at all.
Okay, I see that. But how does that turn the state into the communal husband?
Because while the permanence of the marriage was destroyed, the state preserved its claim on the male's resources. Even if a man did nothing wrong, he could be forced out of his home, separated from his children, and compelled by the state, under threat of imprisonment, to continue funding the household through alimony and child support.
Jeez.
Rikers calls this a blank check drawn on male labor, with no corresponding guarantee of paternal rights. The state enforces the provider role while totally nullifying the husband role.
That is brutal. And he compares this wealth extraction to Executive Order 6102. I've heard of that. Wait, what exactly is that again? You're talking about the Great Depression, right?
Yes, exactly. In 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102, which literally criminalized the possession of monetary gold by American citizens.
Right, they confiscated it.
The government forced citizens to hand over their private gold wealth to the Federal Reserve just to save the government's failing economic system. Weicker uses EO 6102 as a historical precedent for the state confiscating private wealth to sustain itself, and he maps that directly onto modern family courts.
So he views the family court system as like a modern wealth confiscation mechanism.
He describes family courts as hostile territory that is currently occupied by the Seminus singularity. He cites Census Bureau data from 2018 showing that courts award primary custody to mothers in 82.5% of cases.
82.5%? That is staggering.
Right. So the state, functioning as the communal husband, eliminates the biological father as competition for authority in the home, relegating him to a mere funding mechanism enforced by state violence if he ever fails to pay.
I have to push back here, though. Let's just look at the math of Riker's argument. If the system is extracting all these resources from productive men to fund a sprawling welfare state, this surrogate husband, doesn't that mathematical model eventually collapse under its own weight?
What do you mean?
Like, if men realize the contract is a trap and they just opt out, who funds the state?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that is exactly the terminal flaw Riker identifies. He calls it the taxation of masculinity. The entire system is parasitical. It relies on the very men it culturally demonizes. Statistically, men still pay the vast majority of net taxes in Western democracies. But as men withdraw, either through the extreme hikikomori route or simply by refusing to pursue high-stress, high-income corporate jobs because the marital incentive is gone, well, the tax base shrinks.
Yeah, I mean, why work 80 hours a week to make partner at a law firm if the state takes half your income and the risk of marriage is a 50% divorce rate where you lose your kids and your assets?
Exactly.
You might as well just work 30 hours a week, rent a small apartment, and play video games.
And that's exactly what is happening. Riker argues the state is writing massive social checks on a male biological and economic surplus that is rapidly drying up. It is, mathematically speaking, a dying host.
Okay, so if the math is doomed and the system is so obviously punitive to the people funding it, how did society ever agree to this? How did the state get this way? Like, who sold us this idea?
So Riker traces this shift to what he calls the capture of the cathedral.
The cathedral.
The cathedral is a shorthand term for our elite sense-making institutions. So the universities, the Fortune 500 corporations, the legacy media, the legal system. He maps this capture historically, starting in the early 20th century with Antonio Gramsci.
Gramsci was the Italian Marxist, right? The guy Mussolini threw in prison.
Yes, that's him. While in prison, Gramsci wrote extensively on why violent Marxist revolutions were failing in the West. He realized that Western workers didn't want to overthrow the system because they fundamentally believed in the cultural institutions, the church, the family, the schools.
Right, they had a stake in it.
So Gramsci proposed a new strategy, the long march through the institutions. He realized you didn't need a bloody armed revolution in the streets if you could just quietly, generation by generation, take over the schools, the press, and the courts. If you control the culture, you basically control the state.
But Riker says Gramsci's institutional takeover was only half the equation, right? The other half was changing the very nature of language itself.
That's right. The cathedral wasn't fully captured until the introduction of deconstructionism. Riker points to 1967, when Jacques Derrida, a French philosopher, essentially broke Western epistemology.
I've always struggled with Derrida. Can you break down what deconstructionism actually means in practice? Like, explain it to me like I'm 5.
Okay, imagine you're reading a recipe to bake a cake.
Okay.
The recipe says add 1 cup of sugar. For all of human history, everyone agreed on what sugar was. But Derrida comes along and says, wait, language has no stable meaning. The word sugar doesn't actually mean sugar, it's just a symbol.
Right.
In fact, if we deconstruct the text, the recipe's insistence on white sugar is actually a subconscious reinforcement of patriarchal oppression and colonial hierarchies.
Wow.
Suddenly, you can't even bake a cake because the foundation of shared, objective reality is just gone. Words mean whatever the interpreter wants them to mean, usually based entirely on power dynamics.
So when you combine Gramsci's strategy of physically taking over the institutions with Derrida's weaponization of language to destroy objective truth, you get the foundation of what Riker calls the feminist singularity.
Precisely. And Riker draws a really stark historical contrast to show just how far the cathedral has fallen. He talks about how universities used to be these deeply masculine arenas for intellectual dialectical combat. He specifically mentions the University of Bologna, founded in 1088, which utilized the quaestio disputata, the disputed question.
I've heard of that. How did that work in practice?
In the medieval university, truth emerged from collision. A professor would propose a thesis. A student would then violently attack that thesis using rigorous Aristotelian logic, and the professor had to defend it.
Like a debate.
But more intense. It was a martial art of the mind. Institutions demanded intellectual excellence and aggressively punished mediocrity. It wasn't about your feelings at all. It was about whether your argument could withstand the fire of logic.
But now, Riker argues, these institutions have been transformed into emotional safe spaces, and he points out this incredible rhetorical trick they use to police behavior and maintain control. He calls it the Mott and Bailey fallacy, specifically regarding how they push the concept of toxic masculinity. Break down the Mott and Bailey for us.
The Mott and Bailey is a brilliant concept to understand how the modern cathedral argues. Imagine a medieval castle. You have the Bailey, which is the fertile, desirable land down below, but it's very hard to defend. Then you have the Motte, which is the fortified tower on the hill. Very easy to defend, but you wouldn't want to live in it all the time.
Okay, so how does that apply to a modern argument?
In an argument, the Bailey is the highly controversial, radical claim the cathedral wants to push. In this case, the idea that inherent masculine traits like stoicism, aggression, competition, and ambition are fundamentally pathological and evil.
Right, the stuff that builds society.
Exactly. But when challenged by anyone with common sense on this insane claim, the defenders immediately retreat to the moat, the easily defensible position. They say, oh, no, you misunderstood. We just mean that bad behavior like domestic violence or bullying is bad. No one is saying masculinity itself is toxic.
Right. But the second you nod your head and stop arguing with them, they leave the safety of Mayo and go right back down to the Bailey, publishing academic papers claiming that traditional masculinity is a public health crisis.
It's a complete bait and switch.
Yeah, and Riker argues they are deliberately pathologizing the exact virtues, like stoicism and courage, that actually built civilization in the first place.
He brings up the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius to clarify this. The modern cathedral equates stoicism with toxic emotional repression. But Riker argues true stoicism isn't repression, it's emotional discipline.
There's a big difference.
A huge difference. It's the ability to feel fear or pain and do your duty anyway.
Riker notes a very stark statistic here. 93% of workplace fatalities are men.
93%. Yeah. Why? Because men take physical risks. They mine the coal, they construct the skyscrapers, they maintain the high-voltage electrical grids in freezing rain. By pathologizing stoicism and demanding men prioritize their feelings, Riker says the cathedral is removing the psychological armor that makes male sacrifice possible.
And he gives some crazy specific examples of this emotional reasoning completely taking over objective reality. He brings up the 2015 Melissa Click incident at the University of Missouri.
Oh, yes.
This is a communications professor who was literally caught on video calling for some muscle to physically remove a calm, polite student journalist from a public space. But then, when she was criticized, she claimed she felt threatened. Her subjective feeling of threat overrode the objective video evidence of her being the aggressor.
And that subjective emotional reasoning didn't just stay in cultural debates, it actually became codified into hard law. Riker cites the 2011 Title IX Dear Colleague letter from the Obama Education Department as a major turning point.
Right, that changed everything on campuses.
Completely. This directive forced universities across the country to establish shadow tribunals for sexual misconduct. But crucially, it mandated they use the preponderance of evidence standard.
Which is what? Exactly, like 51%.
It's a 50.01% probability. It essentially means more likely than not. It's barely a coin flip. The presumption of innocence, which is the bedrock of Roman law and constitutional jurisprudence for 2,000 years, requiring proof beyond a reasonable doubt, was just erased on college campuses overnight.
Unbelievable. He mentions the 2016 John Doe case at Amherst College as a prime example of this. It was basically star chamber justice.
Yes.
The accused male student had no right to cross-examine his accuser, no right to legal representation in the hearing, and sometimes wasn't even allowed to see the specific evidence against him. It's totally Kafkaesque.
But Riker argues the cathedral's capture wasn't just ideological or legal, it was spatial. The state systematically destroyed private male spaces to prevent men from organizing, speaking freely, or forming high-trust networks outside the purview of the feminist singularity.
They went after the physical locations.
Yeah. He points to the 1988 Supreme Court decision that declared private men's clubs were public accommodations and therefore subject to anti-discrimination laws.
So if a group of guys just wanted to rent a building and have a private club, the government said no, you have to let everyone in.
Exactly. It obliterated the legal and cultural distinction between a public marketplace and a private sanctuary. Riker also brings up the 2002 Augusta National Golf Club controversy. The media spent months framing the effort to force a private golf club of 300 members to admit women as this major civil rights battle.
You know, I always wondered about that. Why golf? Why did the media care so much about a bunch of old guys playing golf?
Because it wasn't about golf at all. Riker says it was about preventing men from gathering privately away from the watchful eye of the state. When men gather privately, whether in a lodge, a pub, or a golf course, they speak freely. They build shadow networks of mutual aid, business alliances, and brotherhood that the cathedral simply cannot monitor or control. The cathedral demands total access to all male spaces to ensure ideological compliance.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. With all this displacement and capture, you'd think men would just universally rebel. But Riker points out this bizarre psychological adaptation he calls the white knight, or the simp phenomenon.
Yeah, that's a fascinating observation.
Right. It's men who signal total submission to this dominant feminist ideology, hoping for just scraps of social or sexual approval. They amplify feminist voices, they perform these super public apologies for their gender. But Riker says this is an evolutionary strategy of appeasement that yields a deeply negative ROI.
Absolutely.
I look at it like a consumer paying premium prices for a software subscription service that actively downgrades their tier and deletes their features every single month. They think paying more proves their loyalty, but the company just views them as a mark. Riker says these men are viewed with utter contempt by the very ideology they serve.
Because female hypergamy, as Riker argues from an evolutionary perspective, inherently demands competence, strength, and status. It does not respect subservience. The white knight is just a dupe.
Yeah.
The system doesn't reward his submission with mercy or affection. It just extracts from him more efficiently. By apologizing for his masculinity, he basically renders himself biologically invisible.
So if the physical spaces are captured, the private clubs are gone, the universities are turned into tribunals, the corporate HR departments are acting as ideological enforcers, where do men go? Do they just retreat to their own private spaces forever? Riker says they didn't just give up, they went to the digital frontier.
They retreated to the internet. And Riker pinpoints a very specific moment, August 2014, Gamergate. He calls Gamergate the Fort Sumter of the modern culture war.
He explicitly says Gamergate was never actually about video games, which is how the media always portrayed it, right?
No. The video game journalism ethics scandal was just the spark. Riker analyzes Gamergate as the first coordinated resistance of disaffected men against the cathedral's hive mind. Men had retreated to the digital catacombs to build meritocratic, anonymous spaces, what he calls the pixelated citadel.
They just wanted to play games and be left alone.
But they found that the cathedral was pursuing them there too, demanding ideological conformity in their escapism. The feminine imperative, he argues, demands total access to every male space, even digital ones, because female hypergamy requires access to male status, wherever it hides, to co-opt it. Gamergate was the moment the cathedral realized men were organizing a resistance outside of traditional institutional control.
But the tragedy of this resistance, according to Riker, is that in their desperation to fight back, men turn to what he ruthlessly labels false prophets. This is where he takes a massive swing at the modern manosphere, taking direct aim at figures like Jordan Peterson on the right and Andrew Tate on the alpha hustle side.
His critique here is genuinely fascinating because it cuts against the grain of typical right-wing or dissident thought. He views both the traditionalist conservatives and the alpha male hustle gurus as different sides of the exact same exploitative coin.
Really? How so?
Let's take the traditionalist advice first, the Jordan Peterson model of clean your room, carry your burden, and man up.
Riker basically argues that telling a modern man to man up in this environment is just gaslighting, doesn't he?
Precisely. Riker argues these traditionalist figures demand that men fulfill their ancient contractual obligations of provision and protection. But they demand this while simultaneously supporting, or at least refusing to dismantle, a legal architecture like no-fault divorce and biased family courts that completely voids any reciprocal obligations owed to men.
It's asking men to step up and serve a system that has systematically stripped them of the authority and the respect that made that service honorable in the first place.
Yes.
It's like telling someone to go be a valiant firefighter, but the government has confiscated the fire hoses and legally immunized the arsonists.
That is exactly Riker's critique. It's traditionalism without teeth. And then on the flip side of the manosphere, you have the alpha influencers pushing hustle culture, figures selling the top G lifestyle.
The whole Bugatti and private jet aesthetic.
Right. Riker calls this a Ponzi scheme of digital influence. These gurus sell hope to desperate young men, telling them to drop out of the matrix, start digital marketing agencies, or learn copywriting. But Riker says they are sprinting right into the buzzsaw of large language models. AI will automate those very low-level digital jobs within the next 2 years.
And Riker points out the brutal mathematical reality of the tax code that these hustle gurus conveniently ignore. Let's say you do what they say. You become a 1099 independent contractor trying to escape the W-2 corporate HR plantation. The state actually penalizes you for trying to escape.
Yes, the tax math is terrible.
As a 1099, you pay the full 15.3% self-employment tax on top of your regular income tax. You are fighting with one hand tied behind your back just to fund the very welfare state that replaced you.
What's fascinating here is Riker's historical contrast. He looks at the manosphere's ideal versus the historical Western ideal. The influencers sell the jungle mindset, be a lone wolf, be a sigma male, focus on hyper-individualized wealth acquisition, which Aristotle condemned as crematistic, the unnatural hoarding of wealth for its own sake.
Right.
Riker says this lone wolf mindset is just a psychological cope for men who are profoundly isolated. It ignores how true Western power was actually built. Power wasn't built in the jungle, it was built in the garden or the medieval guild system.
How did the guilds operate differently than this Sigma male mindset?
The guild was a brotherhood of collective masculine competence. Men worked together to control prices, ensure quality, train apprentices, and protect their markets from state interference. It wasn't cutthroat individualism, it was collective strength and mutual defense.
Where?
A lone wolf can be picked off by the cathedral, a guild cannot.
And the status that these alpha influencers sell, the rented Bugattis, the flashy watches, the digital cash, it's entirely revocable. We've seen this with debanking, right?
Oh, absolutely.
A nameless compliance officer in Omaha can decide you violated a terms of service agreement, freeze your bank accounts, and delete your entire digital existence with a mouse click. You don't own that wealth, you are just renting it from the cathedral.
Exactly.
So my question is, if the traditionalist man-up advice is a trap, and the top G hustle culture is just feeding men into the AI buzzsaw while selling them fake revocable digital status, what is the actual way out? What is Riker's solution for the man listening to this right now?
This brings us to the philosophical core of the book, the Aristotelian response and reclaiming the logos. Riker's solution isn't a new cryptocurrency, it's not a pickup tactic, and it's not a political campaign. It is a fundamental return to classical foundational virtues: prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance.
He highlights temperance specifically, doesn't he? Why temperance out of the four?
Because we live in an economy built entirely on digital addiction. The cathedral thrives by engineering dopamine loops, pornography, algorithmic social media outrage, sports gambling, pharmaceutical comfort. Temperance is the ability to moderate your appetites.
Right.
In this environment, temperance is the ultimate act of political rebellion. An addicted population is a controllable population. A man who cannot say no to his own base impulses cannot possibly say no to the regime. Retaining your agency by mastering your appetites is the absolute prerequisite for freedom.
And this internal mastery ties directly into the external concept of logos.
Yes. Logos is a profound foundational Greek concept. It's often translated as word, but it means reasoned speech, truth-telling, the direct, unyielding correspondence between a statement and objective reality.
Right.
Riker argues that the modern regime's demand for compelled speech, like forcing people to put preferred pronouns in their email bios or declare their allegiance to subjective identities, is not about politeness or courtesy. It is a loyalty oath to the cathedral's ideology that reality is merely a social construct.
He points to Jordan Peterson's original rise to fame in 2016, his opposition to Bill C-16 in Canada. Peterson refused to use compelled pronouns, not because he was trying to be mean, but because he argued it was a state-mandated violation of free speech and objective reality.
And Riker notes that Peterson was entirely vindicated years later when the College of Psychologists of Ontario ordered him to undergo mandatory re-education for his political speech. For Riker, refusing compelled speech isn't about being stubborn, and it isn't about hate. It is a necessary fidelity to objective reality.
If you give an inch, they take a mile.
Exactly. If you concede to the state that 2 + 2 = 5, or that a man is a woman simply because the cathedral demands it, you have surrendered your mind. The sovereign man must refuse compliance through cold Aristotelian logic. You cannot build a parallel society on a foundation of lies.
Okay, so you master your impulses with temperance, you speak the truth with logos, you refuse to comply, but the institutions are still completely captured. You will be fired. You will be debanked. What do you actually do? Where do you go?
Riker suggests something called the Benedictine option.
This is a historical model of survival. When the Roman Empire fell, the essence of Western civilization wasn't saved by politicians or generals trying to fix Rome from the inside. Rome was way too corrupt.
So who saved it? It was preserved by monks. Specifically, Benedict of Nursia and the Benedictine monks. They withdrew from the collapsing, corrupted systems and built isolated, self-sustaining monasteries. They preserved the ancient manuscripts, they preserved agricultural knowledge, they kept the flame of Western civilization alive through the Dark Ages. Riker argues modern men must do the exact same thing.
You know, it's like sandboxing a computer virus. In tech, if you have a highly infected operating system, you don't keep trying to run your vital, uncorrupted programs on it. You can't fix the OS from the inside. The malware has root access.
Right, exactly.
So you build a secure, isolated environment, a sandbox to keep your core data intact and functioning while the rest of the machine just burns down around it.
That is an incredibly apt analogy for the Benedictine option. Riker is calling for the creation of parallel structures that the decaying cathedral cannot touch. Exit is not surrender. Exit is how you win. You stop feeding the beast your labor, your taxes, and your attention, and you build your own sandbox.
But practically speaking, how do you do that geopolitically in 2026? We don't have uncharted wilderness to retreat to anymore. The government has satellites. Which brings us to Riker's ultimate geopolitical blueprint: God, King, and Code, the triple helix of resistance.
Riker's ultimate solution is the construction of a decentralized parallel society built on an alliance of three distinct, historically opposed factions: religious traditionalists, nationalist monarchists, and tech libertarians.
Okay.
He argues that none of these groups can survive the feminist singularity alone. They each have fatal flaws when isolated. But when intertwined, they form an unbreakable triple helix.
Walk us through the anatomy of this alliance. Why these three specific pillars? Let's start with the religious traditionalists.
The religious traditionalists bring the authority of the eternal. They appeal to Thomas Aquinas' concept of natural law. They provide moral anchor points that are objective, non-negotiable, and most importantly, cannot be voted away by democratic sentiment or altered by an HR department.
Well, it makes sense.
A secular dissident can always be swayed by arguments of preference, comfort, or bribery. But the truly religious man operates on a bedrock of divine order. He answers to a higher authority than the state.
But Riker admits that religion alone gets crushed by the state. Monks can be slaughtered if they don't have walls. So you need the second pillar, the nationalist monarchists.
Precisely. The nationalist monarchists recognize that hierarchy is natural and necessary for defense. Riker references Hans Hermann Hobbes' libertarian critique of democracy, arguing that democracy inevitably leads to a feminized managerial consensus because it relies on emotional mobs and distributes blame so thoroughly that no single leader is ever held accountable.
So what does the monarchist bring?
The monarchist principle brings what Riker calls king energy, decisiveness, protective capacity, martial virtue, and the clear understanding that a ship in a storm can only have one captain. It provides the necessary martial authority and boundary setting to defend the parallel society from cathedral incursions.
And finally, the third strand of the helix, the code, the tech libertarians.
The tech libertarians provide the actual physical tools for the exit. The religious man has the moral foundation. The monarchist has the organizational hierarchy. But neither of them can build the infrastructure to escape the modern digital panopticon. The tech wing provides encryption the NSA can't break, currency the Federal Reserve can't inflate, and communication networks the cathedral's HR departments can't censor.
Riker lists the exact tools already in existence to build this sandbox. He points to Bitcoin, not as a speculative investment to get rich in fiat, but for true financial sovereignty outside of fiat currencies and the impending central bank digital currencies.
Right.
He points to Signal for secure, end-to-end encrypted communication that the state cannot subpoena. Starlink for decentralized internet infrastructure outside the reach of hostile local governments, and he specifically brings up Give, Send, Go.
The Give, Send, Go example is critical to understanding how the triple helix functions in the real world. Riker points back to February 2022 during the Canadian trucker protests. GoFundMe, aligned with the cathedral, arbitrarily seized $9 million from the truckers because the political establishment deemed the working class protest inconvenient.
I remember that, yeah.
But within 48 hours, Give, Send, Go, an explicitly Christian crowdfunding platform, absorbed the protests and the money flowed again, completely bypassing the cathedral's blockade. This is the triple helix in action. Christian morality, providing the platform for populist working class resistance against a managerial state, all enabled by alternative tech infrastructure.
So what we're looking at is a modern Holy Week. Riker draws that historical parallel to the alliance of squabbling European powers, the Spanish aristocrats, the Venetian merchants, the papal knights who put aside their massive differences to stop the Ottoman advance at Lepanto.
Yes.
But this time, the alliance is fighting an internal ideological capture, and they are using cryptography, open source software, and classical Aristotelian philosophy instead of galleons and cannons.
This raises an important question, though, for the individual listener. How does a single man listening to this deep dive right now apply this massive strategic architecture to his own life today?
And that brings us to the end of our journey today. Let's summarize the path Riker has taken us on. We started with the terrifying reality of the pincer movement, the algorithmic and technological displacement of male cognitive and physical labor, coupled with a cultural ideology that actively celebrates that displacement.
Right.
We looked at how the state weaponized family law and the welfare system to replace the biological father, effectively communalizing the husband and turning productive men into mere tax nodes.
We examine the capture of the cathedral, tracing the death of Aristotelian reason from Gramsci to Derrida, the loss of private male spaces, and the rise of emotional tribunals. We navigated the traps of the modern manosphere, rejecting both the gaslighting of traditionalists who demand duty without reciprocal rights and the Ponzi schemes of the alpha hustlers selling revocable status.
And finally, we arrived at Riker's blueprint for sovereignty, the Benedictine option, powered by the triple helix of God, King, and Code. So what does this all mean? The most empowering takeaway from Riker's brutal analysis is this. If your life feels impossibly hard right now, if you feel alienated, displaced, and exhausted, it is not because you are fundamentally broken.
No, it's not you.
The system is operating exactly as it was mathematically and culturally designed to operate. The system is rigged, but you now have the source code to understand exactly why and how.
Knowledge is the absolute prerequisite for sovereignty. You cannot fight a matrix you do not see, and you cannot escape a prison if you don't understand the architecture of the walls.
Exactly. And I want to remind everyone, we have only scratched the surface today. We've spent this entire time unpacking the mechanics, but this is just the tip of the iceberg. To truly arm yourself with this knowledge, you must read the source material for yourself. Open up Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books right now and buy God, King, and Code by Conrad Riker. Read the data, study the syllogisms, look at the historical footnotes, and be sure to follow his ongoing work at Conrad Riker on Substack. Also, as a final reminder, don't forget to like this deep dive and subscribe to our show so we can keep bringing you the ideas that are actually shaping the underground currents of our world.
As we conclude, I want to leave the listener with a final lingering thought drawn directly from Riker's epilogue. It is a profound challenge to the modern man. If biology, economics, and a hostile legal architecture have made traditional genetic reproduction seemingly impossible for you in this era, what is your plan for mimetic reproduction? You are, in yourself, a living monastery. Who is the young man you will mentor to ensure the code of Western civilization survives you?